Hello again. I would like to introduce another of the books of SATOW's diaries, which I have transcribed. This one, the Diaries of Sir Ernest Mason SATOW, Sir Ernest SATOW, British Minister in Tokyo, 1895 to 1900, a diplomat returns to Japan. Okay. This was first published in 2002 with an introduction by Nigel Brailey, who's unfortunately since died. But what I propose to do is to read my preface, or editorial preface and acknowledgements, and then to read Nigel's introduction. And this book is available on Amazon and also Lulu, originally lulu.com. And on Amazon, it's available in the paperback and Kindle format. So let's get cracking. Here we go, editorial preface and acknowledgements. It is hoped that the publication of an annotated and indexed transcript of Sir Ernest Mason SATOW's handwritten personal diaries for the years 1895 to 1900 in the original English will be welcomed by scholars and students of Japanese history and diplomatic history as a valuable contribution to understanding not only the man himself, but also some of his very wide circle of friends and acquaintances in both Victorian Britain and Meiji Japan, and the context leading to the pivotal Anglo-Japanese alliance, which was signed by Lord Lansdowne and the Japanese minister, Baron Hayashi Tadasu, in London, rather surprisingly without SATOW's knowledge, on January the 30th, 1902. SATOW's diaries also throw light on the conduct of diplomacy in Tokyo at a time when the diplomatic corps and the British mission legation were very small. The narrow circle of senior diplomats and officials at Tokyo at the time helped to create an intimacy which was impossible in the second half of the 20th century. And these diaries show clearly that he was granted unprecedented personal access to the top Meiji statesmen and politicians, both because of his previous postings in Japan, 1862 to 83, which I have described in my Diaries and Letters of Sir Ernest Mason SATOW, Edwin Mellon Press, 1998, and thanks to his profound knowledge of the Japanese language and culture, widely acknowledged by the Japanese themselves as outstanding. The diaries in this volume are complete and unbroken from Ernest SATOW's arrival in Japan on July the 28th, 1895, as Minister Plenipotentiary and Envoy Extraordinary, after the brief tenure in that post of the Honourable P.H. Le Trench, from June the 25th, 1894 to May the 10th, 1895, until his, that is SATOW's, departure on May the 4th, 1900. Before and after these dates, a few selected partial entries have been included by way of introduction and conclusion, a kind of prologue and epilogue, with a very brief narrative commentary. For those readers who seek a more condensed version or summary of the highlights, my essay entitled Sir Ernest SATOW, 1843 to 1929 in Tokyo, 1895 to 1900, in the recently published Britain and Japan Biographical Portraits, Volume 4, edited by Hugh Cortazzi, Japan Library, 2002, may be helpful. It is Chapter 7, pages 53 to 63. The Lake Chuzenji Diary, as I have chosen to call it, recounting some of the events at SATOW's and other diplomats' recreation hideaway villas near Nikko, appears separately from the main diary in the SATOW papers. And it has here been presented separately, although it covers almost the same time period, i.e. August 20th of 1895 to April 9th, 1900. And in fact, some early entries are almost identical. Apart from reflecting SATOW's apparent intention that the Chuzenji diary should stand alone, this has been deemed a more convenient way to present what is essentially SATOW, his friends and acquaintances, mostly the corps diplomatique, their families and friends, and short-stay visitors such as admirals and other dignitaries, relaxing, i.e. going for walks, botanizing, at which Sato was expert, rowing, sailing, etc., away from the daily grind and summer heat of Tokyo. An alternative way would have been to incorporate all of the choose entries chronologically into the main diary, even though they are rather different in character. It is hoped that readers and researchers will not be unduly inconvenienced by the chosen mode of presentation and may indeed find it useful in some respects. I have added many explanatory footnotes, and in some cases further information has been given in square brackets in the main text. A name index in which footnotes appear in bold type, a list of the principal abbreviations used by Sato, who had his own system of speed writing, and a select bibliography of Sato-related works have been provided at the back of the book after the diaries. All errors of whatever kind are, of course, the responsibility of the editor, that's me. It will be evident that many of the footnotes have been written with reference to annotations in Mr. Shozo Nagaoka's 2-volume translation of the diaries into Japanese, ERNEST Sato Koshi Nikki. And I here explicitly acknowledge my debt of gratitude to him before any other scholar. Alas, he has since died. Without his pioneering work and his encouragement, which was both frequent and friendly, I might never have been inspired to undertake the seemingly never-ending task of editing Sato's diaries for this period. Sato's diaries of his life began much earlier, in 1861, when he was a young man of just 18 years, and apparently ended in 1926, some 3 years before his death. It is thus a sobering thought that the present lengthy tome represents just a small part of the total journal, all of which I have now transcribed. Equally, I must acknowledge the assistance of Sir Hugh Cortazzi, GCMG, who made some valuable suggestions when he saw the first draft. Dr. Nigel Brailey, lecturer of the Department of Historical Studies at Bristol University, for his expert comments and introduction, and the staff of the Public Record Office at Kew, Southwest London, where the original diaries are held. Reference PRO 303315-17. As one part of the voluminous Sato papers, PRO 3033 1-23, which were deposited there after Sato's death in August 1929 in accordance with his wishes. The diaries are also available elsewhere on microfilm. And of course, I thank Mr. Takahiko Kaneko, who so kindly agreed to publish this book, and my wife for her unfailing support and encouragement. Ian Ruxton, Kyushu Institute of Technology, KIT, now known as QTech, Kee-tah-kew-shoo, Japan, October 2002. The final reference there to Takahiko Kaneko is because originally this book appeared in a splendid, wonderful hardcover format, which is now since sold out, limited edition. But after it did sell out, I was able to make this paperback and Kindle version. So that explains that. Okay, now I'm going to read Nigel Brailey's introduction. In the longer run, and in a personal sense, it has to be said that Ernest Sato's transfer back to Tokyo in 1895 as Her Britannic Majesty's Envoy Extraordinary and Minister Plenipotentiary was a misfortune. After 7 years away from Asia in Uruguay and in particular Morocco, he was reconfirmed as an Oriental specialist who would never again be considered for a posting other than in the East. By contrast, his much more narrow-minded successor at Tangier, Arthur Nicholson, the future first Baron Carnock, was to be promoted in due course successively as ambassador to Spain and Russia, and end up as PUS, Permanent Under-Secretary, at the Foreign Office 1910 to 1916, and in the process play a not unimportant role in Europe's slide into war. Sato, meanwhile, was able merely to fortify in retirement his reputation as a scholar of broad compass, most notably of Western diplomacy, with his classic 2-volume study of 1917, A Guide to Diplomatic Practice. Nevertheless, involvement back in the Far East successively as minister in Tokyo and Beijing gave SATOW a platform during the decade 1895 to 1905, when the region's affairs were probably more important globally than at any time before or since. Subsequent to the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-05, believing the region to be stabilized, the great powers of the West, for the most part, transferred their focus back to Europe in advance of the 1914-18 war, and did not seriously re-establish an awareness of Eastern affairs until the 1930s. In terms of the decade 1895 to 1905, the central event was the signing of the Anglo-Japanese alliance on the 30th of January 1902, although for various administrative and personal reasons, it was not announced until the 11th of February. By that time, SATOW had been stationed in Beijing for some 15 months, but in many respects, it can be seen as the culmination of his work in Japan in the years 1895 to 1900. On the British side, it has been seen as the first clear demonstration of an end to the isolation, splendid or otherwise, of which Tory governments under Lord Salisbury in particular had previously been so defiantly proud. On Japan's side, it has been widely claimed to mark its joining the Great Power Club, although a similar end of isolation is perhaps more accurate. It is questionable whether Japan ever gained great power status, and in 1894, few Japanese would have risked a war with Russia, already seen as their real enemy. In February 1904, however, 2 years after arranging the alliance with Britain, which secured her against a new European great power combination, it was Japan who took the initiative by attacking Port Arthur, Russia's principal naval base in the Far East. The ambivalence of SATOW's position in Japan during 1895 to 1900, prior to the signing of the alliance, is evident from the fact that he could obtain no explicit instructions from London despite his own best efforts. All he ever received from Lord Salisbury was one personal letter phrased very much in generalities 4 months after his arrival in Tokyo. And this anticipated his similar experience when he transferred to Beijing following the suppression of the so-called Boxer Rebellion in 1900. In 1900, however, Lord Salisbury seems already to have been losing his grip, discomfited as he was by the outbreak of the rebellion of which he had been given little effective warning, and he was shortly to be displaced as Foreign Secretary by Lord Lansdowne. In 1895, by contrast, Lord Kimberley, as Foreign Secretary in the previous Liberal administration, had stolen a march in the cause of improving Anglo-Japanese relations by appointing SATOW to Tokyo on the very eve of the Liberals' loss of power. And it is conceivable that Salisbury, taking over at the Foreign Office on the very eve of SATOW's departure, was in two minds whether to cancel his appointment. For that matter, it seems quite possible that, had the Tories already been in power, they would have joined the European great power combination, known as the Triple Intervention, in April 1895, which stripped Japan of most of her gains from the war against China in 1894 to 95, a renewal of which always seemed to SATOW to be on the cards. Various factors doubtless contributed to Salisbury deciding, after all, to confirm SATOW's appointment, and thereby his part in settling a resentful Japan's relations with the West down again following the war. But for as long as Lord Salisbury continued to run the Foreign Office, the chances of an Anglo-Japanese alliance, let alone the raising of Anglo-Japanese relations to ambassadorial level, as happened finally in 1905, were effectively non-existent. Despite his own attempts and those of his Japanese counterpart in London, Kato Takaaki, or Kome, to improve things, throughout the years 1895 to 1900, SATOW operated in an atmosphere of some coolness between London and Tokyo. Tories expected independent Asian polities to be subservient and showed a degree of sympathy for the plight of Siam, Thailand, and Persia, Iran, threatened respectively by French or Russian takeover, but they were already suspicious of Japanese ambitions. These diaries contain only limited reference to the rise of Japanese Pan-Asianism, let alone yellow perilism, in this era of so much more concern to other European powers such as France, whose newspapers were replete by 1902 with reports of improving relations between Japan and Siam, even the unlikely prospect of a marriage alliance between the Japanese and Thai royal families. But there is much to indicate what such anti-Western inclinations fed upon. The Japanese were upset by growing restrictions on their emigration, like that of the Chinese, to British Columbia, Australia, and New Zealand, as well as California. They resented European diplomats touting for business, for instance, the purchase of Western-built warships. At the same time, they met with opposition to the appointment of their own consuls to British India to promote their trade with the jewel in Queen Victoria's crown, and the approaching termination of most aspects of the so-called unequal treaties dating back to the heyday of gunboat diplomacy, the 1850s, was prompting thoughts of a reversion to pre-1850s sakoku isolation. Arriving not long after the signing of the groundbreaking new Aoki-Kimberley Treaty of July 1894, the Treaty of Amity and Commerce, SATOW had the job, supervised by the permanent officials at the Foreign Office, rather than Lord Salisbury, to see this renegotiation and the end of Western semi-imperialist extraterritorial rights take effect, while keeping Japan on side within the Comity of Nations. For better or worse, failure in this respect would have eliminated any prospect of the alliance of 1902. Sorry, the Aoki-Kimberley Treaty was actually not Treaty of Amity and Commerce, but that of Treaty of Commerce and Navigation, I believe. Of course, even that alliance, the one of 1902, was originally envisaged in London as a three-sided affair, also involving Germany, of which the Anglo-German link would have been the most important. Ironically, being half German himself, SATOW became by around 1909 quite anti-German, and even the triple intervention of 1895 he recognized as largely organized by Berlin against Japanese interests. Similarly, the scramble for concessions in China in 1897 to 98, which soon alarmed the Japanese with the prospect of the dissolution of the Middle Kingdom, China, was effectively launched through the German occupation of Kiao on the Shantung Peninsula. But in these years, Japanese attitudes, like those of Britain towards Germany, were quite mild. It was to be the breakdown of the negotiations between Britain and Germany in 1901, along with German criticism of the Boer War, that was to lead to closer ties between Berlin and St. Petersburg, making it the more likely that when the Great War came, both Britain and Japan would be on the opposite side to Germany. Finally, however, after a 9-year interval, the years 1895 to 1900 enabled SATOW to resume his relations with his former musume, Japanese mistress or common law wife, and his 2 sons by her. He had continued to remit money to them from his other various postings, but was now able to take full responsibility for the boys, overseeing their education, and later arranging for the tubercular Eitaro, also known as Alfred, to emigrate to Colorado, and the younger Hisayoshi to study in England, which he did at Kew and Birmingham University between 1910 and 1916. Eitaro was to die in 1926, 3 years before his father, but Hisayoshi returned to Japan in 1915 to an academic career that lasted until after the Far Eastern War. Nigel Brailey, University of Bristol. Yes, he returned in 1915, not 1916. Okay, there we are. So that was this book. It's available on lulu.com and amazon.com and all the other Amazon websites. And if you're interested, why not purchase a copy? Okay, thank you very much. I think I will stop here.